All right, the international travel ban lifts tomorrow, and travellers from the rest of the African continent are permitted to enter South Africa for business and leisure. But countries considered high risk, like the United Kingdom, the US, France and Italy, are barred from entering South Africa unless it's for business. Mpumi Mpofu is the CEO of Airports Company South Africa and joins me now live. A very good evening to you, Mrs. Mpofu. Thanks indeed for your time. So we're talking about three airports here. It's OR Tambo International Airport, Cape Town International Airport and King Shaka. Are you ready, for what I expect is going to be a flurry of international travel to and from?
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you very much for the opportunity and good evening to your viewers. We are absolutely ready. Last week, over the last 10 days, we've conducted inspections at the various airports. The minister, myself, our executives, and the director for civil aviation are responsible for oversight and regulation. We conducted these inspections in order to determine, quite simply, whether we're ready in various areas, but more importantly, to stress test the facilities and assess the procedures that have been put in place in readiness for international travel. We're absolutely satisfied. The measures that have been put in place, our COVID monitors are in place, the operations are in full swing, they've tried and tested them several times, and we're absolutely certain. We've even got a few surprises with new technology being deployed just to speed up the process and make for a much more pleasant passenger journey.
And that's exactly, what I'd like to hear. What are some of these measures that have been put in place? There's more travel now. What goes into preparing to ensure that, travellers and your staff are also safe? I mean, OR Tambo is one of the biggest on the continent, and we're expecting quite a lot of movement to be taking place.
Well, one of the measures we've put in place, which we're really just translating directly from the domestic operations that have been really in place since June, is sanitization and disinfection of our terminal buildings. We started by doing that and then installing all the markings across the terminal building to show people how to social distance. We've installed sanitizers across. We'll sanitize you until you're blue in the face. We've installed sanitizers across the terminal buildings in several areas. We've installed barriers where people are not allowed to go. We've installed plastic barriers for screens in service counters. We actually do promote people doing their own self-check-in in order to ensure minimum touch points. And at boarding gates as well, we've installed self-boarding equipment. There's also technology now that helps us with screening passengers. In the Cape Town International Airport particularly, we're able to screen passengers and determine health temperature without coming to close proximity to passengers with a handheld system. But later on, we're also able to facilitate e-gates, which means minimum touch points where people are able to check in, board, and go into the aircraft without touching each other or even being touched by our staff. So all of these measures help to ensure that people go through the journey with minimum risk of infection, but also the screening that is done by our port health authorities actually enable us to determine people who have got high temperatures, move them aside, test them, and then refer them for quarantine in instances where they are found to be with high temperatures or they test positive. So in a sense, we minimize the risk completely throughout the terminal building for people to contract infections or to basically be contaminated.
Yeah. Mrs. Mpofu, I remember during the start of the outbreak of COVID-19 in South Africa, there were some challenges at your airport where some aircraft had arrived from some of the high-risk areas. I know that a government has clearly stipulated that, people will not be allowed into South Africa from some of these countries. What happens in the likelihood of something like that? Are you looking at that as AXA as one of perhaps the challenges which might come up?
Well, it is challenges that do come up all the time, but we've got very clear procedures in place that help us to do that. Today, after the minister has issued the directive, it's very clear what needs to be done. The Civil Aviation Authority issues NOTAM, which are provided to airlines, stipulating very clearly what the requirements for passengers are. And as soon as the airlines receive this, they can't board without implementing the requirements of the NOTAM. So everybody is expected to comply. In the event that airlines take on people who don't comply, who don't have the health insurance that's required, who don't have the PCR certificate that's required, they would be doing that at their own risk because, in fact, as soon as they get to South Africa and they don't meet the requirements, they would just simply be turned back or, in certain instances, put into mandatory quarantine at their own cost and not at the cost of the state.
All right, we look forward to seeing how all of that unfolds, and absolutely quite a number of people looking forward to getting to those international destinations. Thank you very much indeed. Mpumi Mpofu, the CEO of Airports Company South Africa. Let's take a short break.